apologies for having to show up so late and not being able to hear Tony. One of the people I look to for inspiration for the past 15 years, probably, in terms of poetry and activism. I don't believe that you can put pen to paper and call that just writing. Like writing, if you want to write sort of this authentic life, you have to be able to live an authentic life. So you have something where significant, meaningful to write about. And that's one of the things that, I've seen Tony do forever. From the time, where were we, in a cafe in Cheltenham, Pennsylvania. Yeah. And of course, Meg Medina, where are you?
Here, right here.
Jeez. My goodness, I'm sorry.
Nice to
Meg Medina, who is a young adult writer, as you already know. I don't need to go back there, but she's writing about things that are very important for young people to know about, to learn about. And she's writing about it in a way that is entertaining, because you have to know that you can't talk about these sort of heavy topics unless you put it in a way that's palatable, that's acceptable, that connects with young people. And what better way to do that than through poetry? Mm. And that's something I learned at the feet of Nikki Giovanni, where she says she never gave me a C. She didn't? That first year, Jenny? 87 or 88, you don't, really?
I'm sure you must have given me.
I didn't get an A. But when I think about sort of where I have learned how to write and where I've learned how to love writing, it came from two people. It came from my father, who's here, and it came from Nikki Giovanni. Those were the two people who sort of helped me figure out how to navigate this writerly world. And
where's your father?
My father's in the back.
Stand up.
And I'll talk a little bit about him in a second, but when I got to Virginia Tech, I had been immersed in language and literature for all of my life, from the time that I was a baby until college age. And so I knew language and literature like the back of my hand. I was very intimate with it, even though I sort of shied away from it and didn't care about it as much as I would later, as a result of taking Nikki's class. And so the extent of my literary sort of, what I thought was a prowess at the time, came through love poems. And so having read a lot of Pablo Neruda, having read a lot of E.E. Cummings, I Carry Your Heart in My Heart, having read a lot of the poems in my house, I fashioned myself a love poet. And so on campus one day, there was a young lady that I saw and really wanted to be able to convey to her that I was interested in taking her to lunch at a place called Pizza Inn, which had a $4.99 all you can eat. Yeah. And so sort of the only way that I knew how to do that was by writing poems. And this was before I took Nikki's class. I am not a painter, browns and blues, we get along, but we are not close. I am no Van Gogh, but give me plain paper, a dull pencil, some scotch, and I will hijack your curves. Take your soul hostage, paint a portrait so colorful and delicate, you just may have to cut off my ear. Ooh. And so when it was announced...
Somebody liked it.
And she went to lunch with me. And later she would marry me. That's always a great way to end that sort of tale, until I tell y'all we eventually got divorced. And so I decided to take Nikki's class, and it was advanced poetry. And sort of my extent with poetry, of course, my involvement with poetry had been what I'd been read to as a kid, what I'd read on my own, and these love poems that I'd written. And so I took Nikki's course in advanced poetry, and then proceeded to take a class on Black Studies the next year, and then took a class called Children's Literature. which I think I took it for credit and to sort of be in your class. I had no interest whatsoever in children's literature. And ended up writing a poem about my father called Daddy that I got a C on. But I digress.
I'm sorry.
T.S. Eliot said, immature poets imitate, mature poets steal. To be fair, there have been quite a few poems that I've written over the years that I have sort of borrowed from Nikki in terms of style and flow and theme. And you all remember her book, Love Poems.
Mm-hmm.
And so I mentioned that I had gotten divorced. Well, I got married again, and the way that I had wooed my wife was by writing her a poem a day for a year. Mm. And of course she married me. So I guess poetry is, in the very least, has gotten me married. And so about 5 years into our marriage, this happened. According to Google, there are 5 phases of sleep. Somewhere between 2 and 3, I shift to my right side. If you are woken during this stage, you may feel groggy and disoriented. I move my hand from my forehead, ready for the slow delta waves of deep sleep. If phase 3 is too short, sleep will not feel satisfying. Are you awake, she asked. I am on the edge of falling. Is someone calling my name? Should I answer? My wife is aware that I am a light sleeper. She knows that the hint of a glimmer or mild cacophony will send me back to phase 1. The eyes are closed, but if aroused. Wait, someone is calling my name. Are you awake? I see her now, leaning against the cherry headboard, concerned, confounded, curious. I wonder, have I forgotten something significant? Birthday, anniversary, dishes. Why don't you write me love poems anymore, she asked at 3 a.m. Should I answer? I open the other eye, seeing her full on. I sit up, inch a little closer to her naked land. You are still my ocean, my dear. Your hips, my soft raft. Those 2 lips, the oars I steer. You are the poem. If you were a couplet, I'd rhyme you. Okay, she smiles. Just don't haiku me anymore. I want an epic. Anything else, my dear? Well, since you're up, can you take care of the dishes? If you were a couplet, I'd rhyme you. If you were a ladder, I'd climb you way up to the top and I'd find you. If you were a doorway, I'd enter you. If you were unhinged, I'd center you. If you were a secret, I'd uncover you. Then seek out your treasure, rediscover you. If you were in front, I'd behind you. Pull out some espresso and grind you.
Romantic.
I go to elementary schools and middle schools all the time, and I can never read this poem. It feels so good to be able to read it. Let's say you're a bossa, I'd hum you, play you on guitar, and then strum you. If you weren't my wife, I'd wed you, then pull out a quilt and I'd bed you. But since you're my woman, I'll just love you and kiss that sweet halo above you. So, if you know Nikki's poetry, that last poem is a direct borrow. I mean, yes, I learned from Nikki for 3 years directly, and then I learned from her indirectly by reading all of her books over and over. And of course, when Tony and Michael Datcher and Kevin Powell and all of us in the 90s at the National Black Arts Festival, there were 3 poets or 4 poets that we were all like reading and talking about. Nikki, Sonia, Haki, and Barack. Mm-hmm. And so their poems influenced, and I borrowed a lot from my professor. And so probably around 1995, there was a poetry cafe in Washington, D.C. on 26th and P Street in Georgetown called It's Your Mug. And at this cafe, every Monday night, Tony Blackman, who is now the U.S. State Department ambassador for hip hop, go figure. She was a co-host, and Tony Asante Lightfoot was the other co-host. And so poets would gather there on Monday nights. And so if you're familiar with sort of poetry in general, black poetry in particular, in terms of the scenes, there are all these cliques. I'm probably not supposed to talk about that, but there are all these cliques. And so you got like Kwame, you got like Dark Room, you got all these different sort of groups. You got West Coast, and so all these poets would come to this place. If people were in town, they'd come here. And so I remember being there one day, and there was a young student from Georgetown University who was reciting a poem. And the poem was offensive, and Nikki used to talk about how poetry can behave or misbehave, okay? And I remember it was a question I said, do you think is there bad poetry? And she said, well, I don't know if there's bad poetry, but there's poetry that behaves and there's poetry that misbehaves. And so, of course, you have an E.E. Cummings who misbehaves, but you kind of get the impression or the feeling that he knew the rules before he broke them. But then you got poets who don't know the rules, and they break them. And so we're in It's Your Mug, and this poet recites his poem, and it's offensive, and it misbehaves, and it's upsetting to the women in the room. And of course, I come from this tradition of poets who don't just write, they're activists, and so they speak up, not just with their words. And so, in the middle of his poem, I said, cut. Now, you can't do that. Tony knows you.
I did the same thing.
Right, I know, because there are certain people that they're going to sort of be authentic, they're going to be real, and they're going to make sure. And I think that's what the Black Arts Movement poets did. I remember Haki telling me that once. If we heard a poem that was bad, we called that person out. That's what I remember him telling me. And so I said, cut. And that was unheard of. You don't do that in the middle. It's disrespectful. And I said, cut. And then I said, that's enough. And the room was like, what? What is going on? And so I remember reading an interview with Nikki, the Claudia Tate, Black women writers. Right. And there were Maya Angelou, Alice Walker, June Jordan, and there's an interview with Nikki. And in Nikki's interview, Nikki says, they were asking a question about what about if people don't like what you're reading or what you're saying? And she said, I dance naked on the floor. If you like it, great. If you don't, you can go home. And I always thought that was interesting, that idea of dancing naked on the floor. And in that moment, I said, this can't happen. And so afterwards, several of the poets, Renegade and Kenny Carroll and other poets we all know of, they came up to me and said, yo, you can't do that. And I was like, he has to write a poem that cooks. And they were like, huh? Dancing naked on the floor. Write a poem with tension, like some Baptist church split. Let it walk a tightrope between Congregation 1 and Congregation 2. Write a poem that finishes school, a magna cum laude poem. Let it be momentous. Learn something meaningful. Share something significant. Write a poem that looks good, not homely or sway back. Give it posture, poise, and profile. Turn our heads when it walks by. Stomp our feet when it smiles. On some superficial level, make us want to marry it. Or at least remember its name the next morning. Write a poem that works. Write a poem that works, has a job and does it promptly, follows rules and responsibilities, gets a raise or at least a head nod. And when it's not feeling well, when your poem ain't feeling well, give it sense enough to call in sick and not waste our time with unmet expectations. Write a poem that has a family, not some single life of soiled one-night stands. I mean, your poem should be in a relationship. Let it commit to something, move beyond soap opera sex. Let it be passionate about something, and if your poem gets excited, let it be in the privacy of its own beautiful mind, because we can all watch cable at home. Write a poem that travels, gets outside your cramped apartment and travels. Write a poem that travels, leaves all that tired baggage and catches a plane somewhere, takes us on a journey to an imagination spawned not by television and film, but one that has been somewhere we haven't. Write a poem that reads, please. Write a poem that reads more than headlines and sitcom credits, a culture poem. Write a poem that knows how to talk, not some misbehaving foul mouth looking for attention, an eloquent poem. Write a poem that dances wild and free, naked on the floor, a gutsy poem. Write a poem that cooks. I mean, it ain't got to bake or cake, but at least let it know the ingredients. Write a poem that exercises. I mean, cycling is not required, but steps never hurt nobody. Write a poem that runs for office. I mean, get a clue, poets. Write a poem with an inkling of suspicion. I mean, it ain't got to solve a crime, but at least let it offer us a tip. Write a poem that is contagious. Write a poem that is contagious. Let it inspire. Make us want to write a poem about how beautiful and breathtaking and hopeful and tragic life is. so to end, so I had written about 17 books. And and then a publisher asked me if I wanted to write for middle school students. And I had never thought of doing that because I was writing love poems and poems for older children, for us. And I said yes, because I love saying yes. And she said, well, send me something you have, and I have nothing. But I was like, yes, I will. And I sort of figured it out because, that's one of the other things about sort of poets writing in the tradition of the Black Arts Movement. We aren't necessarily waiting for things to happen, because the writing is active. Like the writing is cool, like in your room or in your cafe or at school. But the point of the writing is for the writing to get out and hopefully move something, and shake up something. And so I was like, yeah. And so I went and wrote this novel that I felt was good, that I felt was the best thing I'd ever written. And here's one of the ways I knew it was the best thing I'd ever written. I had written 17 books, and maybe my dad had read some of them. I never heard a whole lot. This book, he called me after he read it and said, I loved it. That's when I knew I got something special. And then I got the book, I got a note from Nikki. And Nikki said, and in the past I called Nikki, Nikki, can you blurb my book? Can you do this? And Nikki, I'm envious of how well you respond to people. I'm still trying to learn how to do that. And she wrote a letter, I didn't call her, and she said about a paragraph about crossover. And the publisher ended up putting it on the cover, a line of it, bold, explosive, I love the crossover, everyone will. And I said, I think I'm onto something. and the really cool thing about it is that the book had been rejected 22 times because publishers felt like boys wouldn't like poetry and girls wouldn't like basketball and basketball and poetry wouldn't go together. And so after 22 rejections, I sort of decided, well, I'm gonna do what we do. I'm gonna publish the book myself. I think your first book, Nikki, was called Night Comes Softly. It wasn't Night Comes Softly? It was, gotcha. Night Comes Softly was a book. It was a black cover with black raised lettering that was published by Nick Tom Limited. And I assume that was your company. It was self-published. We come from a tradition that we don't sit around and wait for things to happen. We want to make it happen.
Right.
And so with Nikki, when I was in her class and seeing her speak, and she was traveling, and I said, this is what I want to do. Like, I want to be that person who's able to share their poetry around the world and hopefully offer something to people. And so I decided to publish the book myself, and a week later, I get an email saying, Houghton Mifflin loves your book, and we would be honored to publish it. Where I got this interest in writing that was nurtured in Nikki's class was from my father, who had forced me to read the encyclopedia as a kid. Do y'all remember Funk and Wagnalls?
Oh, yeah.
Which you got from Safeway for free. It was like some kind of rewards. I had to read the encyclopedia. I had to read Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Milton Taylor. And it had this little gold sticker on it that said, Most Distinguished Contribution to American Literature for Children. And I was like, whatever, I'm not reading that. What does that mean? But I read it and I loved it, and I didn't tell him because he had forced me to read it. The new book comes out April the 5th, and it's called Booked, B-O-O-K-E-D, and it's about a soccer player who hates reading. Why couldn't your dad be a musician like Jimmy Leon's dad, or own an oil company like Kobe's? Better yet, why couldn't he be a cool detective driving a sleek silver convertible sports car like Will Smith in Bad Boys? Instead, your dad's a linguistics professor with chronic verbomania, as evidenced by the fact that he actually wrote a dictionary with, get this, footnotes. In the elementary school spelling bee, when you intentionally misspelled heifer, he almost had a cow. I love that line, man. You're the only kid on your block at school in the entire world who lives in a prison of words. He calls it the pursuit of excellence. You call it Shawshank. And even though your mother forbids you to say it, the truth is you hate words. So yeah, it comes out. all of the poets and novelists who came before me, and I'm sorry I didn't get to hear you tonight. Thank you, Nikki, for introducing me. Thank you, Jenny, for being here. Thanks, my dad, for being here. Thank you, Dr. Gavin and Furious Flower, for having all of us. I will end with this, and that is Claudia Rankin said in her book Citizen that because white men can't police their imaginations, black boys are dying. And I take it a step further because she's so on it with that. I take it a step further, and I think the reason why I write for children, I think the reason why I write poetry, I think the reason why Meg writes for children and young adults, I think the reason why Tony writes for children and writes poetry is because ultimately we want to allow books to be mirrors and windows. And we want to make sure that not only can black kids be able to see themselves and see what's possible. We don't write just because we want to open up a world of possible for the kids who look like us, which is so very important. But we also write to make sure that all the kids are able to develop some sort of imagination. Because the reason why black boys like Gregory Gunn, who was killed 4 or 5 days ago in Montgomery, Alabama by a white police officer who was 23 years old, because he said he was walking through the neighborhood and he saw this suspicious man. Gregory Gunn was in his own neighborhood walking. The reason why we're policing our imagination is because you don't have an imagination. You can't see outside because you only read things that have been you. And so you imagine what kind of books were on this white police officer's shelf when he was growing up. You can't tell me that there is not a direct connection between the literacy, the literature, the language that people are exposed to as children and who and what they become as adults. My goal in writing for children is to make sure that children develop an imagination that allows them to imagine a more beautiful and a better world. And that's why this conference is so important, and I'm so glad to be a part of it. Thank you.